I think I know many people here, but for those who don't know me, I'm Andrew. I'm an instructor in the BIDS department in pediatrics. My clinical side, I'm internal medicine and pediatrics. And then on research side, I started life in biophysics, modeling cell trajectories, and I decided I want to move to modeling patient trajectories. So my work over the last few months and year is focused on modeling longitudinal patient data. So I'm really excited to tell you today about some collaborative work that we have done with Epic and Microsoft Research in what we call generative medical event models and how they can improve with scale, similar to large language models. So we'll jump into that. I want to start by saying this is a large collaborative effort by many people, and would like to acknowledge all the hard work that went into this, and that for Yale for participating within Cosmos, which gave us the opportunity to participate in this work. So to me, this is the motivation. How can we actually effectively learn about human health and disease from the millions of patients who receive care each day? Not just in small one-off studies, but on a really large scale. How can we build systems that actually are capable of doing that? We talk about this in the paper, but if you had such a thing, you could provide more accurate diagnoses, you could provide improved prognoses, you could do treatment planning, and you could optimize, that's supposed to say clinical workflows here. And with these things together, we could try to realize the goal of having a learning healthcare system where you collect information on patients as you're treating to your best of your knowledge. You can learn from that information, and you can provide insights and changes which can affect future treatment. So this is the big picture goal of what we're going to do. And I always like to start, I think some of you may have seen this if you've seen my talks before, but I always like to start with this. I view this as what medical education trains us to write. This is a standard history and physical note. It starts out with an HPI, which is a section where you describe what's going on. You move towards the assessment and plan, where you say what you think the patient has happening to them and what you're going to do to address this. And there's tons of great work, and I think many of the things featured in this seminar have focused on all of these things, like how do we actually take this data and all that effort, pull information out of it, and do things to improve healthcare. But complementarily, I view that medical education trains us to read this. And what this is the time-stamped ordered series of everything that we measure or do for patients. And it not only is the events themselves and their values, but also the passage of time. And it allows us to build up this dialogue of what we think is going on with the individual person. This person is presented with a history of heart failure on certain medications. They have a chief complaint of shortness of breath, and they have vital signs. And we kind of use this story to create a narrative in mind of their health state. We can see that we're going to give them a medication called Lasix, which should help with a heart failure exacerbation. And we can see that they generated urine, which is what we want to see. And we can say, okay, this is a good response to Lasix. We're on the right track. We're treating their heart failure. And then we get an unexpected word in the story, which is that the oxygen saturation is dropping. And this changes the meaning of everything and makes us focus on different components that were going on in the prior set of data that we collected. We can say, we're going to order a new test, which helps reveal the fact that the patient had blood pressure, had a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot, and we didn't expect it in the beginning because their heart rate was lower than we would have been triggered to think it was a blood clot. And it was lower because of the specific medication carvedilol, which blocked the body's response to generate a fast heart rate in the setting of a pulmonary embolism. And you can see as the story reads, we kind of build a state of what's going on and help to interpret it. And context is critical to this. So that analogy of that sequence with critical context is what makes this perfectly suited for using these same models which underlie large language models today. So this is kind of the schematic overview of what we'll be talking about today, a medical event foundation model. You have some sort of tokenized data. You take all of that time-ordered sequence of data that we just talked about, and you flatten it out. You serialize it into one long sequence of discrete tokens. You put that through a neural network. It could be any kind of sequence model, like nearly everyone doing this right now. We're choosing a dense transformer model for our sequence lengths. And you undergo a process in training where your model will generate a prediction, like a hemoglobin of 12.2, and it will be penalized for errors between that and the actual value, which could have been a hemoglobin of 11.9. Once you undergo the full process of pre-training, you can now have a versatile event prediction model. You can take that event, you can seed it with data, and you can run forward in time and Monte Carlo sample 100 future trajectories. From those trajectories, you can aggregate and compute what is the risk this person gets cancer in the next 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, all from the same model. What is their cardiovascular risk? How many visits will they have to the emergency department? Essentially, any outcome that is represented in your data, you now have a time to event model with that. And because you're doing Monte Carlo sampling, you have a point estimate and you have confidence intervals on those things. So this is the kind of the framework that we're working in. Why would you want to do an approach like this? I think there's some, very, other than kind of the practical things I just talked about, there's some other very key things. One is that this is based in representation learning. What it means is that anything that you can map to an embedding space, you can now use as part of your sequence. Let's say you think genetic data is important for understanding future predictions. You can get a genetic embedding model, you can start to map that in. Let's say you have biosensor data of some sort. You can find a way to bring that data in. Let's say you have environmental data that you want to incorporate in your model. If you can tokenize that, you can put that in the sequence and you can start to use that to help your predictions. The next thing is pre-training. And I view pre-training as this very interesting data-driven statistical regularization. So buried in one of the 2 OpenAI scaling law papers, I think this is figure 11 from the less commonly cited one, is this figure. And I think a lot of really interesting work in this area kind of hinges on this finding right here. So I'll explain it really quickly. So what they did was they took an autoregressive image model, predict pixel n from pixel n minus 1 through the beginning. They trained it from scratch on image classification on ImageNet. And they took the same model and then did that pre-training, the autoregressive, predict the next pixel. And they compared the performance as a function of model size in those 2 kind of training regimes. The from scratch regime is in orange. As you make the model bigger, you have better capacity to predict. At some time you plateau and then you start overfitting. If you take the same exact model architecture and you make it pre-train on the pixels, just predicting what is the next pixel, what is the next pixel, you remove that last layer and you swap in a classifier layer and you do fine tuning, all of a sudden you break through that plateau that you had and your model continues to improve with scale. This is not something driven by picking the right, lambda penalty in your lasso or something else from a regularization thing. This is fully driven by the fact that next token prediction is a kind of regularization task in the data. It's unlikely that the noise to get pixel 25 right is the same noise that would let you get pixel 37 right. And those things kind of cancel out. Pre-training, the parallel to this is task agnostic, which means you get a model on the other end, which is also task agnostic. And I would also say that even more so than language, this pre-training objective matches what we actually want our final model to be able to do. As soon as you finish pre-training a language model on the internet, you realize that it will not just answer questions when you ask it questions. And you have to go through a whole set of separate layers to make it a good chatbot. But here, we actually just want more of a patient filled in with what could happen in their future. So there's fewer downstream tasks that are really required. There's been a lot of prior work, which I don't have time to cover here. There's a paper which covers nearly 40 of these types of models. But here's 4 common ones which use this kind of pre-training principle. These to date have been really limited by full expression of the multimodal data that's important in healthcare. I'll say that the Comet model doesn't really tackle this one in full, but they've also been limited by the breadth of training data. How many different patients this is sampled on from what kind of nationality of a sample, and also doing a full scaling analysis, understanding, do these sorts of models continue to improve like we just showed in that other graph, or do they have some sort of different trend that's going on? So we'll walk through this paper, which is very dense, and I cannot really cover all of in the remaining 20 minutes that I have here, but we will go through the highlights. We'll go through the Cosmos data set as a unique training data set for this type of model approach, the current tokenization that we're using, the model training and scaling evaluation, and then we'll go through some of the more detailed results, and then land with the discussion and limitations, and also, foreshadow some of the future directions which this work can take. So we'll start with Cosmos. So this is really a community-driven and collaborative project. So there are approximately 1,700 healthcare systems which contribute a subset of their data to the Cosmos repository. This data is then de-identified and aggregated, and it's also deduplicated. So that way you can line up the same person who's received care in Hartford and in Yale can be linked to the same underlying record within Cosmos. And it really is derived from these hospitals and organizations contributing their data to it. Epic doesn't have rights to the data without the organizations actually contributing it. What you get, and what has grown over the last 5 to 10 years that this has really taken off, is a data set that has approximately 300 million unique patients with 16.3 billion encounters as of the last time I checked in August 2025. And this data is continually updating through ETL processes. Yes.
The people in this room are part of that 300 million.
I imagine if we have been seen in Yale New Haven's health system, if anyone has, then you might be in this. There is opt-out of research, which you can select. So most JDAT polls and things like that will check that. All JDAT polls will check that. And data sets delivered to you will be patients who've opted out of research.
So we contribute.
I guess I contributed in more than one way to this work. But yes, it is. I think, I do not have time to talk about that kind of societal level thing, but I think it's a very important discussion. And this is continually updating. This is not a frozen static snapshot that updates every 5 or 6 months. This is continually updating with new data. So this is going to provide a unified storage format for encounters. So again, I guess this is getting at, other ways of aggregating data don't necessarily have the same dialect when they talk about everything. But this ensures in some way that you have the same dialect. When we talk about encounters and encounter types, everything has already been mapped for you so that an ED encounter is an ED encounter, because all of these health systems are contributing to the same thing. So we have the same encounters, we have the same setup for diagnoses, lab values, vital signs, medications, procedures, demographic and social information, and many more, including cancer staging and genomic variants, with more things to be added. I've heard that on the pipeline, there's plans to bring in many other domains. One of the most exciting ones for this group is probably when are any sort of text domains going to be landing in this, because this is a massive data set. But I think as anyone who works in this, one of the challenges is meeting what we talked about in number 1, that is de-identify. How do you de-identify notes at the scale is going to be quite computationally intensive. And then I want to say, anyone with questions, please interrupt while we're going, and then we can make sure that those are answered. So the actual data used for training is a subset of that data. So the first thing, there are 2 main filtering steps. The first, right now, we did not touch the pediatric population patients. We're just focusing on adults 18 to 120 years. They were required to have 2 face-to-face encounters in a 2-year period between 2012 and 2025. And the encounters that counted to that were not kind of administrative burden, administrative placeholders or canceled appointments. They were actual things where medical information probably was exchanged. The breakdown of this, there are hundreds of encounter types in Epic. The top ones are 17% were office-based encounters, 2.1 were emergency, and then there are many, many encounter types, each contributed about 1% to the encounter types. So this, and then when you throw out all the people who no longer have tokens or who no longer have data rows after you do this, you're left from the 300 million people with 118 million unique patient trajectories. So again, this excludes all the children and things like that. Okay, this is probably one of the most important aspects of this model, which is probably in the paper least fleshed out in terms of all the varied approaches that you could try. So one big challenge is tokenizing this data. This is not text data, which has a standard UTF-8 encoding that then everything gets mapped to bytes and you can do byte pair encoding or word piece or something like that. We have all kinds of different modalities, so we're going to try to figure out how to do that. The general token sequence looks something like this. There's a startup sequence token. There's a bunch of the demographic tokens that are added in, and then every encounter is bracketed in these encounter start, followed by the data, followed by encounter end. And we're going to talk about, I guess, I only have one set of dot, dot, dots, but you can imagine in between all of those commas, there could be other dot, dot, dots, and we're going to talk about the things that go there. So the first thing are diagnoses. We took a flat approach to encoding diagnoses here. This is an ICD-10 format diagnosis. The first 3 contribute to a unique token. The next 2 and the next 2 each contribute to 2 other unique tokens. You can imagine there's some really low-hanging fruit in terms of byte pair encoding and merging across here to build up a more expressive vocabulary. Labs were chopped down to the 1,000 most common lab types, and they all were represented by 2 tokens. A test token, like what was it, and then a quantile. Buckets, just 10 different buckets of what decile that value happened to land in. Medications used ATC codes and were chopped up into, again, 3 tokens, so each medicine is represented by this. Procedures each got their unique own token, and the most common 1,500 procedures were included. Time is between all of these things. So time itself is a token and landed into pre-specified bins, the smallest of which was 1 to 5 minutes, and the largest of which was 3 to 6 months, and you had many successive ones of those. Okay, so many different versions of the model were trained. The 3 that were part of this paper were small, medium, and large, which were 62, 120, and a billion parameters respectively. And you can see the other, embedding dimensions that are here. And there was the standard scale up in the NLP where you project from the embedding dimension to 4 times the embedding dimension, and then, come back down. The model was built on Qwen2 architecture, some specific differences from for anyone who's been working with the NanoGPT repository in GPT-2, different activations, Swiglu instead of Jelu. There's rope instead of learned position embeddings, and there's group query attention here. The context window for all these models was 8,192. I don't have it on here, but the batch size was 512. So each of sequences, so each batch comprises approximately 4 million unique tokens. Okay. Any questions, the model training or tokenization?
So did you encounter the situation that the EHR's tokens maybe longer than the input?
Yes. Yeah. If you look in the supplement, I think there's a histogram of the sequence length per person. And there are some people's sequence lengths that are hundreds of thousands of tokens. Context window is much shorter than that.
So did you take the clinical notes into account?
So the only data types that are in here are the ones listed right here. Diagnoses, labs, medications, procedure, time, and then the demographic information. Notes are not part of it, and actually vital signs are not part of it as well in this first iteration. So on one side, you can look at this as not so great. On the other side, you look at all these results as these are the worst that they'll ever be, probably, when we are able to add more things in. But those are great questions. Yes. So one of the main limitations we'll talk about is the types of data which are present here, and what do we think can actually be captured?
Yeah. How did this tokenization distinguish different events? So at different time steps.
Yeah. So essentially everything that occurs simultaneously will be ordered in between temporal tokens. So you'll have, let's say there's a heart rate, and 5 minutes later will be measured a respiratory rate. You would have the heart rate token, the quantile token for what heart rate it was, the 5-minute token, the respiratory rate quantile token. So that kind of idea of a heart rate, 5 minutes, a respiratory rate is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different tokens. Does that make sense? So essentially the model will be predicting what's going to happen next. One of the things that can happen next is that time will elapse. And it can predict 5 minutes will elapse, or it can predict 3 months will elapse.
There is like instruction time tokens.
Yes, yeah. So there are binned time. Every delta time between every observation gets shuffled into one of, let me see if I have this in here. There's I think approximately 100 different time bins that it can be shuttled into. Okay. Okay, so these are some of the more plausibility type results and can be useful for hospital operations. So this is a test of encounter type calibration. So you take a cohort of individuals and you sample a time for them and you say, I'm going to forecast your future life for the next year and say, how many times do you have an office visit? How many times do you go to the emergency department? How many times do you get admitted to the hospital? And you can see that we have the predicted probabilities and the ground truth fraction for counts across these different buckets. And the model is a little bit better calibrated for the small counts than the higher counts. We can look at the error in these numbers, so the mean absolute error in the predicted number of encounters within 1 year. And what we have here for reading the color code is the more dark purpley color is the largest model, the lighter orangey color is the small model, and the gray is the best performing supervised classifier baseline, which nearly always is XGBoost on this data. You can see lower is better in these. The mean absolute error for the number of inpatient, emergency, and office visits outperformed the supervised baseline. The next was looking what's happening in these encounters. So if we take a given encounter, remember they're bracketed by start and end, and we can look at which diagnoses are present, which labs, which medications, which procedures are present. And we can look at the precision recall curves here for the presence of specific diagnoses within the encounters. The two takeaways, there's a lot of stuff on this, is that the comparator here is just a baseline, is a look back. So if you look at the set of diagnoses, labs, medications, or procedures which occurred within encounters in that look back period, those are the points that you get. And then the other takeaway here is that the dark purple curve is always above and to the right of the smaller one, of the lighter ones, meaning that the larger model is doing a better job of predicting which diagnoses or labs or medications or procedures will happen in this encounter. And I don't want to read too much into one of these, but you can see this is a very nonlinear scaling, right? There's the ability to predict which labs will be ordered emerged with the increase in model scale in a nonlinear fashion. The small and medium models were nearly tied. The large model really bumps performance. I think that's seen again and again in language modeling tasks where you may have a smooth progression in next token loss, but on your downstream benchmarks, your model may show no improvement for a period of time until you hit a certain level of performance and all of a sudden it can do the task. And that's similar evidence here is that some of these tasks are much harder or complex than others. So the next thing you can do, and this is probably one of the more interesting clinical side of things, is to say, let me take again a seed cohort of patients, and I'm going to predict certain important clinical outcomes. So hemoglobin A1C is a marker of average blood sugar used in diagnosing and monitoring type 2 diabetes. We have chronic kidney disease. We have prediction of diagnoses like neuropathy or retinopathy, and ASCVD, which is the essentially cardiovascular risk. And we have different time horizons here. So the takeaway is you have these variety of different conditions. And as we go from small, medium to large, the model starts to outperform the supervised classifier baseline across more of these categories. Is it beating them on all of them yet? No, it's not. There still is performance to be probably gained. But it's showing the trend that we see in language modeling, which is that a bigger model will produce improved results across a range of tasks. And again, the model is not fine-tuned to do any of these tasks. These are all done in zero-shot prediction standpoint. You will simulate 100 futures for a patient, and you'll see in how many of them does a patient who had stage 3 in the seed progress to CKD stage 4 in the Monte Carlo samples, and use that for the prediction. Another one which is very important from a hospital workflow standpoint is the readmission risk. So one of the most, I would say, one of the more stressful things is deciding for a patient whether they are safe enough to go home. Right, you're especially for certain patients who are high risk, you're saying, I think we have done all the treatments and medication, done all the things we need to do here, you're safe to go home. And this can be a very challenging branch point in the emergency department or discharging from the hospital. And again, this shows this nonlinear task emergence. We see small, medium, and large. with large outperforming the other sizes and outperforming the supervised baseline. So something like this, especially when we start to add all of the other data components in, could really help be a safety check. When a team says, I think patient so-and-so is ready to go home, you could look at this and you could see what their chance of coming back in would be. And a bonus of a zero-shot model is you could also predict and see what they might come back for. I'm discharging them for a heart failure exacerbation, and I can see that their readmission risk is 20% in the next 72 hours. And of those readmissions, 50+% of them are from a heart failure exacerbation, or could they be from something different? You could have that information come out. This is a very dense figure, which is essentially looking at, can this model provide a lead time on diagnoses across a range of categories? So here we took a common group of individuals presenting with things related to abdominal pain and asked, if we take the diagnosis time and we go back in time for that individual, what is the model's predicted risk for that specific condition compared to the other ones that you might be considering, or the differential diagnosis? So the way to read this plot, this set of graphs, is to say, we'll look at the, let's see, the hepatitis one is a good one right here. So this is chronic viral hepatitis. And essentially, for individuals who eventually end up getting chronic viral hepatitis, if we look at 110 or 1 days before encounter, what fraction of those patients were at least 10% risk for having that condition? And you can see that as you get more proximal to the encounter, more near to the actual encounter occurring, the number of patients whose risk for that condition rises. And importantly, the risk for patients who actually went on to have a different condition does not rise that much, meaning the model is able to identify a differential risk for that category of diseases. And you can look at similarly the AUROC for these predictions as a function of time as well. I do want to spend a moment before we hit the limitations on the challenges of doing Monte Carlo sampling for these predictions. So your precision of your results entirely depends on how many samples you are willing to spend inference time doing. If you simulate 100 futures for a person versus 1,000 futures for a person, you will get different results. And that's what this is showing here. And this is, doing some derivation of these sources of this, but essentially, this probably scales as 1/x for the number of samples that you do, the essentially gap between your predictive performance and what you're trying to achieve. This can be a very expensive way to do diagnosis, right? Let's say I want to do 1,000 simulations. Each one of those requires generation of 5,000 tokens. All of a sudden, that's a ton of forward passes per model. And now I want to do it on 118 million people. All of a sudden, I need more GPUs than OpenAI has to be able to do that. So that's an area that my lab is currently interested in working on. And if you want to talk to Erica more about it, you can. Or me. I'm always happy to talk about all this stuff too. But Erica is focusing on that for her PhD work. I do want to hit the limitations of this. One is this is all real world data. That means we have gaps before the sequences we measure, we have gaps within the sequences we measure, and we have gaps after that are data after the collections we have. This leads to all sorts of potential biases. It means that the first time we say a patient has hypertension may actually be the 4th time they had it if we could see their prior history, right? No one just appeared at age 45 in the health record. They all have a life story before that. It can also lead to censoring of downstream events. Let's say in a region, people who end up getting a diagnosis of cancer X always get transferred to this fancy hospital, and that hospital is not on Epic. That means they disappear without that diagnosis from this data set. Tokenization is a huge one. We're treating all numbers as a part of a decile bin. I can tell you there's many units on the hospital where every patient spends their life entirely in one of those decile bins, being the bottom one, like the oncology floors. Many patients' blood counts are always very low, and a difference between platelets of 10 versus platelets of 50 is what's important, and those may all be in the same lower bin here. Also, I think this was up there very briefly, so you may not have caught it. This model vocabulary size is around on the order of 7,000 different unique tokens. That's much smaller than a current language modeling vocabulary. It has big ramifications for how many tokens it takes to express someone's life. And we were talking about, overflow of context window. This is another area for big improvement. And lastly, in evaluation, we didn't focus on extraordinarily precise disease definitions. Performance is largely delivered in aggregate. We don't have differences between demographic groups. And then there's this huge issue of right censorship where actually death records are not super complete within Cosmos. But all of these things are on the horizon of things that we want to improve and continue to work on. So with that, there's, the future work really is expanding access and types of data that are part of this, doing full time event analyses, and then counterfactual predictions. When you look at enough predictions, you're like, well, what if we could change this? How would that have made the downstream thing, different? And that's also what we're really interested in working on. So I think I'm like 1 minute over for my half. I apologize. Oh, okay. Well, then let's take questions. I will have to myself leave in about 10 minutes, but I'm happy to take questions.
Just notice you use a relatively small model, just 1B. The largest one is the 1B size.
Yes.
So have you tried different model size and test the performance?
Yeah, so I didn't have that here, but there's like a full chinchilla style scaling analysis up to 1 billion. 1 billion was selected because with that context window and 1 billion can always fit on an A100 or H100 with a single one. So they don't have to do model sharding essentially during training. That was one of the main decisions where to break it at 1 billion. And I will say, if you read the chinchilla scaling analysis here, there are drastically different numbers, right? Like the common, most of the scaling analyses have found somewhere on the order of 20-to-1 tokens per parameter for pre-training, right? This analysis found that these tokens are the right scaling is in the order of 1,000-to-1, 1,000 tokens per one parameter in the model, which is, again, why the model is smaller for the number of training data points that we use. And I think that's because our vocabulary is 7,000. It's not 70,000, right? We essentially have less stuff per token. We need more tokens to saturate the parameters.
So basically, you modify the Qianwen2's architecture to make it fit to the vocab size you need.
Yeah, so it's a randomly initialized model, and it only uses the architecture, the structure of it, the backbone. It doesn't use any of the weights or anything like that. So it's just the architecture, and yes, the embedding matrix up front is totally modified to be only 7,000 entries, and that then means on the downstream side, the last projection head is also a much smaller projection head.
And what's the criteria you use to monitor the model chain, the loss?
Yes. And I will say I didn't do the model training. The Microsoft collaborators did a lot of the scaling training there, but essentially I'm sure they monitored loss and gradient norms and stuff like that, and for stable training. I think with this size model and this vocabulary size, training is a little more stable than when you try to do a larger model with 100K vocabulary size. So we did, and in our experience, so we were also training local versions of these, and it's a lot easier to train big models on small vocabularies more stably than on giant ones.
I have a question about the contact lens. So for different prediction tasks, where the contact lens influence the prediction result?
Yes, I 100% think that there is a big interaction there. Nearly all of the good performance ones are short time horizon. And when you think about it, if I have a person, this is demographic information, which includes things like their age. And I have a seed and I'm up to here and I'm going to start generating, and I have not yet produced my encounter. I'm going to start dropping out my prefix. And I'm going to lose perhaps the most important information about this person when I, continue to advance. That, to me, that's a huge area for improvement, is how do we fit more life into a smaller context window? And I think changing vocabulary size, like building a compression algorithm into the vocabulary generation, is a big step in that direction. And then I'm also interested in building, various methods for adapting kind of the long context approaches used in language to this data as well.
Thanks.
Yeah, if you look at across the paper, it does best when it has to predict a short time horizon. I think there's probably two things. One is that, and the second is just like the teacher forcing, right? The more tokens it has to generate, the more it can accumulate its own error because it's an autoregressive method.
I know for like for another situation like the prediction length should be fixed, but the prefix token length should be varied. In that case, so the longer context will be produce better result or not?
Oh, we have done separate tests where we look at, and I think there's two things going on there. So we've done a bunch of tests looking at predictive accuracy with longer seed lengths when someone's admitted to the hospital. And the more context you give the model, the better it can do in predicting outcomes. A challenge there, you have to kind of, if you figure out which direction you're adding tokens, like it's sometimes a short sequence is not always the same difficulty to predict an outcome for as a long sequence when you're sampling your data. I don't know if I'm saying this in a clear manner, but sometimes the most uncertainty happens within a short time interval of hospital arrival, for example. So if you want to see how your model does with improved context, you can look at how it does with a longer seed, but you have to make sure that time zero still remains with the same degree of uncertainty in the following tokens, like from a conceptual manner. So I guess you would want to add, if you want to know how a model does with an hour of seed data after someone arrives to the emergency department, you would probably want to add context in this direction, prior encounters and things like that, because you can't look at how the model does at hour 1 versus hour 2, because a lot of the uncertainty gets resolved in that first hour of being in the emergency department. But yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things in terms of how the model can do with more data. I think doing ablation studies of which data modalities are most important is also like helpful.
So for the MCMC, did you use the same strategy or use like different context with the MMC?
So everyone, essentially here, the most important thing to think about is who is the cohort, who meets the entry criteria, and then what is their time zero. And everyone was, the full context available up to 6,000 was used to seed the Monte Carlo sampling to give room for, in the worst case scenario, 2,192 tokens of predictive space before we started to drop out the prefix. Does that answer the question?
Thanks.
Is there a Zoom question?
No, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you everybody for being here, and I'm happy to talk about this in more detail with anyone. And again, some big